The life of the flesh is in the blood, so for the wages of sin be paid, and this payment to be effective, the blood must be shed. It is the blood, and the blood alone, that will satisfy the righteous demands of a holy God, for only the blood can effectively translate the ransom price into acceptable currency. Now, there are teachings going about where people say Christ only needed to die on the cross. He didn't need to shed his blood. Well, we understand that if he didn't shed his blood, then there is no redemption, because the blood is the only effective ransom price that God will accept. It is the only acceptable currency. So the manner in which the animals die must be by the shedding of the blood. So we see that on the Day of Atonement that the animals are tied to the horns of the brazen altar, and their throats are cut, and the blood is caught in a basin to be taken into the Holy of Holies and sprinkled on the mercy seat, and in this way, and this way alone, that the redemption price is applied. In this way and this way alone, sin is covered and atonement is made. If the sacrifice is strangled or stunned or thrust through or whatever, but does not shed its blood, then its death cannot be applied to atonement, so it cannot redeem. So let's understand the importance of the blood. In this matter of redemption, it is the blood that is efficacious, effective, right? Efficacious, we call it. And without it, the death of the animal, although it pays the price, cannot translate this into actual redemption. It can pay the price of the slave in the slave market, but it cannot buy him out or from the slave market. Only the blood can do that. So for redemption to be complete, there must be the death of the sacrifice. This death must be substitutionary in nature. It must be by the shedding of the blood. The blood is the proof of the life given. It's the seal on the contract. It's the signature on the check. It's the acceptable currency. But for redemption to actually take place, there is even more that must happen on this Day of Atonement. The blood must be applied to the mercy seat. And unless the blood is applied where it can be effective, then indeed it cannot be effective. The high priest must go into the Holy of Holies and sprinkle the blood before the mercy seat and on the mercy seat. It is only through the blood that he can even approach God. Leviticus 16:14. Leviticus 16:14. And he shall take of the blood of the bullock and sprinkle it with his finger upon the mercy seat eastward and before the mercy seat, and he shall sprinkle of the blood with his finger 7 times. It's only through the blood that sin can actually be covered, that atonement can actually be made. So, for there to be redemption, there is a need for an acceptable high priest to apply the blood, and he must do this in the acceptable manner. Then there is a need for a mercy seat for the blood to be applied to. Isn't there? Without the mercy seat and without the high priest, there can be no redemption. Even if we have the animal and it's killed and it's substitutionary and the blood is shed, without an acceptable high priest and without a mercy seat, the atonement still cannot be made and we can still not be redeemed. Only when all this is done is redemption complete and atonement, that's covering, is achieved. But when all this is done, then the slave is free. He's not only paid for in the slave market of sin, but he is brought out of the slave market and set free. He is bought out and he is brought out. And this is a wonderful teaching, a wonderful doctrine. So on the Day of Atonement, we see a yearly enactment of a perfect type of redemption. Right? It satisfies all the criteria to deal with sin, but only in principle and not in fact. It clearly shows the ground rules, and it's a wonderful shadow of what one day in the fullness of time will become substance when Christ, the Jewish Messiah, fulfills it all. Matthew 5:17 and 18, Christ says, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled." So now, having understood the absolutely essential part the blood plays in this matter of redemption, let us go back to Genesis 3:21 and Genesis 4:1-5 and Genesis 8:20 and 21. Now, what are these verses about? Genesis 3:21 says, "Unto Adam and to his wife did the Lord God make coats of skins and clothe them." Genesis 4:1-5 is where Cain and Abel bring their sacrifices, and Abel's sacrifice is accepted. Genesis 8:20 and 21 is where Noah, after the flood, brings his sacrifice before God, and God accepts the sacrifice that he brings. These are the verses on which our principle of redemption is established, and when we look at them carefully, we see that they don't specifically mention the shedding of the blood. So, is our doctrine flawed right from the start? Have we got it wrong right from the start? The blood's not mentioned, only the death of the animals. No, our doctrine still remains perfectly intact. As we've consistently seen, and we've said over and over again, all doctrine is progressively revealed. Right? The progression builds on the doctrine, but it never contradicts it or corrupts it. And also, let us be clear that the progression never abrogates what has gone before. It doesn't disannul it. God doesn't change his mind. He doesn't get it wrong the first time and have another lash at it. God gets it right from the start, and never gets it wrong. In this particular instance, we can now, once we've understood all we've come to understand up till now, we can now look back at our situations in Genesis, where our doctrine starts, and be sure that, although it's not specifically stated there, the blood of the animals in the sacrifices was shed just as is required in the law. We can know that in Genesis 3:21, the animals that provided the skins to clothe Adam and Eve did in fact shed their blood. We can know that the sheep that Abel sacrificed did in fact die, though the Bible doesn't actually specifically and technically categorically state this. And we can know that its blood was shed. We can know that when Noah sacrificed after the flood, he shed the blood of the animals he sacrificed. We can be quite sure of this because now that the law is given, we understand that there would have been no satisfaction for sin otherwise. And yet we know that these first sacrifices were acceptable to God and were accepted by God. If we look back to Genesis 3:21, we see that when Adam and Eve were clothed with the skins, they were covered. In Genesis 4:4, we see that Abel's sacrifice was accepted by God. In Genesis 8:21, we see that Noah's sacrifice was accepted by God. Without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sins. There was remission of sins here. So we can say, conversely, that where there is remission of sins, there is and there must be the shedding of the blood. And so we can be satisfied to know that the blood was shed in these sacrifices, the life was given, redemption was provided, and God had it all covered right from the start, and we can be quite confident about it, and we'll leave it there.